Well, thank you all for joining us here today. We definitely respect and value your time and really appreciate when you choose to spend it here with us. And we want to strive to always give you the best value possible so that you know that you made a great decision when you came here and joined us here today. And today will be no exception. You're in for a real treat. We're going to be chatting today with Jan and Jillian Yuhas, and we're going to be talking about negotiating boundaries and conflict resolution. So welcome, Jan and Jillian. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having us.
Oh my gosh, that's adorable. And for those of you who don't know them, Jan and Jillian, identical twins, for those of you who are seeing this, and for those of you who are not, just to give you some context here, and they are relationship and boundary experts, and they're dedicated to helping individuals navigate the intricacies of interpersonal dynamics. And a lot of people don't think of that as a negotiation. So I was thrilled to be able to get Jan and Jillian here with their background in psychotherapy and family mediation. They're committed to resolving relationship disconnects, for want of a better term. And as business consultants, they help people leverage their insights to assist companies in establishing thriving workplace cultures. And we could all use a little more of that. So let's dive right in. I mean, you guys, I know, do a lot of work around boundaries, and we hear a lot of talk about boundaries these days, a lot of lip service paid. But I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand what exactly the term gets thrown around a lot. But why don't you tell us a little bit about, healthy boundaries? What are they and why are they so important?
Yes, I think one of the biggest misconceptions out there is that people set unilateral boundaries and they're setting ultimatums in their relationships. And then they're wondering why the other person isn't receiving it well or working with them in order to respect their boundary. And so that comes from more of a safety perspective or a trauma-based setting a boundary in that sense to protect your immediate safety. But when it comes to really elevating our relationships personally or professionally, we also need to negotiate boundaries within that dynamic around a shared value if we're going to let each person have a voice and come to a resolution that meets the overall goal of the relationship, but our needs as well as a person.
Yeah, beautiful. And, it's funny because I said in the intro, I think one of the hurdles I have, when I talk about the art of feminine negotiation, most people don't think about their personal relationships as negotiations, whether with their kids, with their intimate partners, with service providers every day. And for me, if you think about these as negotiations, you're going to show up more intentionally. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree with you because whenever you are voicing your value and asking questions and trying to gain further insight as if there is a disconnect or you're just trying to find some way to, have that mutually beneficial relationship, at the same time, we're showing mutual respect for each party involved. And so this is almost a basic skill that we all need to have for every facet of our life and
Yeah.
relationships, because it really just shows of how high value we are as an individual, but then also that we're trying to show respect mutually across the board.
Yeah,
So
beautiful. And I mean, I love the idea about getting more intentional about our boundaries as well, because often in our relationships, whether personally or professionally, we just we go along and things build up and build up and build up, and then all of a sudden we explode and have very inappropriate reactions, or we just end up being reactive generally. Whereas when you think about these things with intention, you show up differently, right? You show up, you have a plan, and you show up with a little more grace and a little more elegance to get those more constructive sort of agreements. Now, I'm sort of blurring the lines here. I keep talking about whether personally or professionally. Are there different kinds of boundaries?
So we phrase it a little bit different, whether it's a personal boundary or a professional boundary. If it's a personal boundary, we might say, I feel dismissed when I don't receive a call back from you. I value communication. How can we get on the same page when it comes to our differences in communication styles? If it's a professional boundary, we might say, it seems like we're not on the same page here. I value teamwork. How can we align in order to meet our deadline? So we're depersonalizing it a little bit when it comes to our professional boundaries versus our personal boundaries. We might express a little bit of a feeling of what we're feeling in that moment or the emotional trigger we're experiencing.
Yeah. Okay. And how does boundary setting help conflict resolution? I know that you guys do a lot of work in that area, as do I. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
So when we're setting a boundary, the goal is actually to open up the communication channels to have a constructive conversation. And so we're pointing out the behavior, not the person, but we're saying, hey, we're not on the same page here. There's a disconnect or misalignment, and we want to be able to have a conversation about it so we can get back to where we originally were, and both people can feel at peace in that relationship. So in a way, we're making requests to open the communication channels, but we're doing it in a way that's collaborative, constructive, and it makes it easier if you do have more of that fear-based mentality. Oh, I don't know how this person's going to respond. But if we're doing it from the we mindset, it's much easier for the other person to see that we're trying to work with them, not against them.
Yeah. Yeah. And so how did you come to write Boundary Badass? Great title, by the way, for your book. So what was the impetus for you guys to go, you know what, we need to get this out in the world?
So it's a little bit of personal and professional path to writing our book. Personally, we grew up in a rural farm town of 900, moved to a metropolitan city of 3 million, and that was a huge culture shock for us.
Yeah, I guess.
So during that whole experience, we were used to being heard and understood back home. And then when we got to this huge city, we realized and we always kind of had a we mindset being twins. We didn't do stuff that was going to impact the other person's life. But when we encountered all these individuals in the new city, we realized that not everybody has a we mindset. And so we faced a lot of like painful experiences with friends or even romantic relationships. Professionally, we started mediating at the age of 21 at a crisis hotline for teens who ran away from home. And we used to mediate boundaries between the teens and the parents before they returned back home to know what that environment was going to be like. And professionally, that led us to getting our master's in marriage and family psychology. And then later on, we became family mediators as well.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting background. And young, I'd love it. And I know I'm going sort of off track here a bit, but I imagine there's not only a fair bit, but some pretty intense and nuanced negotiations when you're dealing with a crisis line with teens at crisis. Can you tell us a little bit about either, what you learned or some tips that you took away from the big learnings about negotiating in that high stakes situation?
So a lot of teens, I feel like they ran away from home, not because they wanted to, but it's because didn't feel heard or understood within the family dynamics.
Yeah.
And so it's really important for parents to understand that their children have a voice as well, because our voice is developed usually from infancy up to age 7 is where our belief system is derived from. But if a parent has a mentality, my way or the highway, and is very rigid in regards to rules or guidelines, a child doesn't feel like safe to express themselves. And so often their needs are being dismissed or going unmet. And so they feel like they have no other opportunity except to escape that environment and run away in order to get a reaction because they're not feeling heard or understood when they are trying to express themselves.
Yeah. Wow. Now, you had mentioned about a we mindset before, and especially coming from that smaller community, 900, that's pretty tiny, I got to say. I can't imagine the culture shock suddenly jumping to 3 million. But I'd like to chat about that for a minute, because that was one of the real impetuses for me, having been, a lawyer for 30 years and then creating this art of feminine negotiation sort of concept. Because I realized that, much like you, like I'd come from a sort of a smaller, low income neighborhood. And then I started the practice and everybody treated each other with sort of dignity and respect in that community, and then start the practice of law. And everybody seemed to be out for themselves, right? It was this very competitive environment. And, I often bitch these days about, if we look at our TV, even most popular TV shows now, we don't have like the old school, I'm dating myself here, kind of old school protagonists. We're almost always rooting for the bad guy, right? Whether it started with Sopranos or Breaking Bad or Ray Donovan. And, we're hoping that really is an anti-hero gets ahead still. So, and for me, I believe that we get more when we take collaborative approaches and when we show up and treat people with dignity and respect, even when we're facing, bullies or people who are trying to exert their power, rather than butting back with that energy. I feel like we get more if we consistently still attempt to show that respect while setting boundaries. So if you could share some of your views in your conflict mediation work and the boundary work about the difference between this we versus I kind of mindset and the outcomes you get with those approaches.
Yeah, so when it comes to the way we negotiate, it's we versus the relationship problem or whatever, the business problem, family problem, whatever we're doing. So it's like, how are we going to work together and try to resolve this amicably in a way that shows respect for ourselves, but also mutually respectful? And so that, comes from using that calm tone of voice in constructive communication, but you're also being assertive, because we also have to understand, if we do not speak up, then we're part of the problem. And then that's also known as conflict avoidant. And so having that we mindset, though, you're trying to find a way to reach a middle ground that allows each person to feel like they get some part of the ultimate win-win outcome. So in that moment, you're thinking, because each person's decisions or their thoughts or ideas are going to impact the overall relationship outcome or the other person involved. So this is why we're saying open up the communication channels. And so that way, if I make a decision, it's going to impact the relationship. So that means it impacts the other parties involved. So that's why each person deserves really to have that voice and be heard and understood, but then reach some kind of connection that allows us to regroup and head towards more of that collaborative approach.
Yeah.
And someone who has a me mindset is usually stuck in an egocentric way of thinking. So they're only concerned about their wants or their needs. And usually that comes from our childhood wounds. And so that person usually has unhealed wounds that they haven't really worked through. So they're operating from their ego, where if we're operating from a we mindset, we're coming from a more heart-centric place, and we're operating based on our value system.
Yeah, I would say more leadership mentality, growth mindset.
Yeah, and it's funny when you say that, because it's true. Like, we have those childhood wounds, and then they get compounded by the conditioning, which I think COVID, we've seen a bit of a shift where we're starting to finally recognize that more, traits that used to be considered so-called feminine traits and seen as a liability. And we all were so busy stifling them, thinking we couldn't get ahead. And now people are like, hey, and I think what one of you used the words connection. And it's really at its core, negotiation is all about building trust, building connection, building relationship. And again, whether personally or professionally or all the spaces in between. So, and the other thing that you touched on is this about that opening the lines of communication and keeping that channel open. And it's so counterintuitive to what we've been taught, right? Where it's like, hold your cards close to your chest, don't leave yourself vulnerable. And I'm glad to see a little bit of softening on that. And I want to just poke a little bit more to put a pin in it for our listeners. Ego, when that came up as well, because I call it one of the 7 deadly sins of negotiation. And again, we're very conditioned to show up from that egocentric approach, as opposed to truly seeking to understand and meet the needs of the other party. What's your experience and your tips on that, how to address ego?
Yeah, when we're mediating with egocentric personalities, we will use discovery questions, which I'm sure you're familiar with, in order to gain insight into their perspective around the issue. So a lot of times people make false assumptions about somebody's their belief or where they're coming from. And so we really need to understand where their underlying belief comes from and how come this position that they're putting on the table is so important to them. And so once we start uncovering their belief around their position, we can gain clarity in order to bring that together for the win-win outcome that we're trying to search for.
Yeah.
Also, too, I think a lot of times people who are in their ego state, they're communicating with emotion, which is less likely to be heard and understood, because emotions are often one-sided perspective. Where if we're using more of our heart-centered thinking, that's more love and logic. And so when we communicate that way, people are more likely to understand us, because we're also using our values in a way to communicate and connect. And with our values being universally understood, we're more likely to understand each other and actually hear what the other person says.
Yeah, some great stuff in there. And for me, I always draw that distinction between being emotional, as you say, showing up in that state where you're less likely to be heard, versus bring the emotion, like bring the emotion of your deep why to the table, but don't be emotional in it. And also, I'm glad you guys raised about this idea about questioning, that discovery, you call it, because the art of curiosity is a game changer. When we can appreciate the power of questions, especially if we're hitting that conflict zone where we're hitting a block in any of our negotiations or difficult conversations, just flip the script and suddenly get curious and start asking questions, right? I find it can really break the ice. So I love
It
that.
also, yeah, it also helps lower defensiveness if somebody is egocentric, because most likely that person was not heard as a child. And so that's their trauma response coming out. But if you start inquiring about their perspective and getting to know them, they're going to soften that ego or defensiveness that they might be coming to the table with.
Yeah, and I think too, you can acknowledge their perspective, but doesn't mean you have to agree with their perspective right away.
Yeah. And that's an interesting perspective about, because I think most of us, we don't recognize the trauma or the fear that infuses somebody else's, especially when somebody's coming from an ego-driven place. It can really be a game changer, as you say, when you put yourself in their shoes and allow yourself to feel that and show up differently. And I call it elevated active listening, where, and it struck me as you were saying that when you're dealing with somebody who's being really sort of confrontational, and then as you'd said, you reflect back what they're saying to let them know they've been heard. And I encourage people, it seems counterintuitive, do it, make their argument even more graciously than they made it themselves. And it amazes me how it takes the steam out of people. Sometimes they're so busy getting whoa, whoa, trying to win the argument. And suddenly they hear their position being articulated in a way that's even better than they articulated themselves. And all of a sudden you open the space for that softening, right? To have some more meaningful discussions. So.
We're diffusing the power struggle that they're trying to create. And instead we're coming from a big picture perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, beautiful. And as you say, it addresses that childhood wound, because they're like, I actually am being heard here. They may not agree with me, to your point as well, that when you doing it in that way doesn't mean you're agreeing with them, but at least you're letting them know they are seen and heard and respected. Now, I wanted to circle back something that really tweaked for me when you were talking about that we approach, which I think is so important for everybody in any negotiation, whether that business or in our personal. But in particular, you mentioned especially as twins. And I got to confess, I wonder, as identical twins, how did you set boundaries to retain your own identities? I know it can be very difficult sometimes, because I imagine you get lumped in as a set, very often. So how do you cope with that?
Yeah, growing up, we did get lumped into a set very frequently. So if one person, friend was mad at one, they were mad at both of us. So that was definitely something we experienced. But I think we've always learned to embrace it as like a strength, as, in a way that, and use it as more of a powerful, source for us to stand strong. We are quite independent, but also we have that balance of independence and interdependence, like every other type of relationship. But for me, like, I'm definitely more of a detailed oriented person, where she's more of a big thinker person. And so, our mother always separated us in classrooms growing up. So I think that allowed us to really identify, our own independence, even though our activities in the home were always collaborative. And then I think it's almost natural for us to be in business with each other, because we have that trust and that loyalty bond, and it allows us to really strive towards goals.
What a great combination. You've got one who's the big thinker, the other one who's the detail, and together you're the whole package. That's gorgeous. And I want to, again, for our listeners, to put a pin, something you said there, I think is so profound and important and often overlooked. And that is to take something that many would see as a weakness or a struggle, an obstacle to overcome, and your perspective on it was to see it as a strength. And I think that's such a powerful mindset shift. And for our listeners there as well, because I think women in particular, well, both women and men today, it's, my TEDx talk was on why the world's so out of balance, because as we said, both men and women are trying to stifle those so-called feminine, because we've been so conditioned to see those as a weakness. And I invite all of you, lean into those so-called feminine skills, right? See them as a strength, as Jan and Jillian were saying. I think that's a really beautiful perspective. So let's talk a little bit about the relationship between personal boundaries and self-worth, because so much of how we show up and negotiate is based on our negotiations with ourselves, right? Our own mindset. So tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so self-reflection is really key here in terms of really understanding who you are as an individual. And usually we recommend people develop their top 5 values they want to operate from in their personal relationships, and top 5 in professional. And there might be some overlap in those 2 different sets of value systems, but at least operating from 5 gives you a roadmap and that aligns to your authentic truth. So when our actions, our daily actions and how we interact with everybody else is in alignment with our value system, then we are elevating our own value, and other people also know where to meet us because this is our standard of what behavior we're willing to accept and what we're not willing to accept.
And also too, those values that we live by, that's going to send us a cue if someone sort of breaches one of those values or goes against one of those values. That's our cue to take care of us and then also set a boundary in that moment, because that's going to identify that our emotional needs not being met based on that value.
And I think people don't understand their value. They don't know what their value system is. Go back to your emotional triggers. Your emotional triggers are your insights, because the opposite of the emotional trigger is the value. So if you feel dismissed or ignored, you might value communication in your relationships. If you feel blindsided, you might value transparency. So those emotional triggers are your cue in terms of what values you need met, because they meet your emotional needs on a deeper level.
That's a nice way. I haven't heard it framed quite that way before. I think that's a great way to approach it. And tied to that, as you were saying that, it got me thinking about our self-love, like our sense of value. So often we don't set up boundaries. We're not comfortable setting up boundaries because at our core, we don't value ourselves enough, right? And, I know often when I do workshops, one of the things I do is have the women in the room list 25 things that they love about themselves. And oh my gosh, it is amazing to me. The room, it's like deer in the headlights, like at least half the room at almost every workshop sit there unable to come up with 25 things that they love about themselves. And do you find that when people don't have that sort of innate sense of their own value, that it makes it tougher for them to set boundaries?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I think it can be hard to tap into, like, is this my place to speak up? And often too, like if we grew up in a home where our voice wasn't heard, or if it was dismissed, whatever it may be, like it can be much harder in our adult relationships, because our adult relationships are going to reflect our first relationship experiences. And so if we are fearful to speak up, or we're told to be the good girl or whatever, we may not feel safe to speak up. Or if we grew up in a home that was very chaotic, high conflict, and we would raise our voice, then now we're trying to raise our voice, but then that can also be seen as, either one can be seen as a trauma response versus us coming from a place of assertiveness aligned to our truth and our value, which brings us inner peace.
Good. And so the word assertiveness has come up a couple of times, and I think it's so important because most people, I think, confuse assertive with aggressive. And again, for
absolutely, yes,
they are not the same thing, and for those of you who followed me for a long time, my RFIT model is about the A is for assertiveness with this starting, and then the REFIT, rapport building, empathy, flexibility, intuition, and trust. But assertiveness simply means you show up from a place of confidence, and that confidence comes from knowledge, and that knowledge comes from preparation. So be intentional about knowing what you want, what outcomes you're looking for, how you want to show up, how you want to be seen, do that preparation, and then you can stand in that place of absolute confidence and assertiveness, even while you're being compassionate and curious and all of those things. So I'm glad that you've raised that issue of assertiveness, so that, because most people, I think, shy away from it often or overdo it based on misconceptions about it. So now, and on that point, earlier in the discussion, you talked about the difference between boundaries and ultimatums, and maybe we should circle back to that. Like, can you give us some examples of what would be the difference between a sort of a healthy boundary setting versus an ultimatum?
So when it comes to ultimatum, usually it's a conditional term. If you don't do X, then I'm going to do Y. And so you've put a demand or a threat being displaced onto the relationship or the other person. And rarely does somebody meet us there when it comes to being forced into a certain behavior. When it comes to setting healthy boundaries, this is where it comes to honoring our value and negotiating a solution. So it might be like, it seems like we're not on the same page here. I value communication. What can we do in order to bridge the gap between our communication styles? And so we're trying to work with that person to come to a resolution where each person has a voice. Because if you have one person who likes to communicate all day long and the other person feels emotionally flooded by that and they don't want to communicate all day long, then we have a disconnect in our communication styles. And so that's when we need to understand what each person's preferences are. And then we come to a compromise or a, solution.
I think too, one way to look at it is ultimatums can create this gridlock, this impasse, because it's like taking expectations and putting them on the relationship dynamic. And they're very much that me mindset, one-sided perspective where,
which is going to breed resentment and distrust in the connection.
yeah, and our boundaries are all about how can we find ways to better our relationship as a team and as a way that we can actually honor and respect each other without it being detrimental to the relationship.
But while simultaneously respecting our own value and self-worth.
Yeah. And it's interesting as you're saying that, because it's true. When you come from that ultimatum approach, you're less likely to get the outcome you want. And adding to that, and just for our listeners, even in those cases where you do, because I know a lot of people who bully their way through and go, well, I get my way. Well, you might get your way in that particular moment, but it has long-term, you don't have buy-in to that agreement. And without the buy-in, without the trust, as you say, then there's going to be long-term consequences, because next time they're going to have their guard up more, or you're going to lose more in the long run than you gain in that moment by taking that approach. So I think
and the receiver might say yes, but even though they meant no. And so then they might start doing
passive aggressive behaviors because they're now resentful for, agreeing to something that they weren't really on board with.
Yeah. And that's both personally, we see that in intimate relationships all the time, or with kids. And also, I think people don't recognize the extent to which that happens in business, where, somebody says yes in the business deal, and then you're wondering why you've got all these people backing away or resigning from the deal or trying to get out of it. It's because of the way you approached it in the first, trying to push through an agenda rather than getting that sort of consensual approach. So
I think too, if you are pushing an agenda, that also means that you're in that ego state. You're not even respecting yourself in the moment.
Absolutely.
Because you're more concerned about just winning versus mutually beneficial collaboration.
Yeah. And it's funny, we haven't talked about winning. And I agree, you've just hit, that's really at the heart of the problem. When you approach this with a win-lose mentality, which sadly is what we're taught about negotiations, it's all about winning or losing. Even a course I took in law school on negotiation, it was all about, you got your marks based on who got the highest negotiation. And there was no room for creative out of the box sort of solutions. I'm like, this is kind of a faulty way to be teaching this concept. So can you share some tips with us on how to handle someone who does not respect your boundaries?
So someone who does not respect your boundaries after you try to work with them collaboratively usually tells us this person only is concerned with their needs and they're operating from their ego. They can't see outside of themselves. There's psychological blind spots going on. And sometimes when we're dealing with individuals like that, we have to redefine our relationships. And that might look like, okay, how often am I going to spend time with this family member? If I know, for example, 8 hours is too much, then maybe I only spend 2 hours at family events. Or if it's a colleague at work, if I know this person doesn't respect me, doesn't listen to me, I'm going to reduce the amount of interactions I have with them to the bare minimum. So we're redefining it, and we're setting personal boundaries for ourselves in that moment rather than a relationship boundary. It's a personal boundary to protect our safety and peace.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah. And it's funny, I was circling back to that win-lose thing. I was just thinking of that, like, oh my gosh, we see that so often, like in our legal profession. It's like our entire legal system is based on this. Our language around it is all about, you win cases or you lose cases. It's the opposing counsel. Everything pits us against each other. And we see that in business as well. And I'm hoping we're going to see a shift with the kind of work you guys are out doing there and changing people's mentalities on that. Now, what are some easy boundary creation wins that you can share with our listeners today so they take something away concrete in their back pocket that they can imply?
Well, I definitely recommend practicing with people you feel safe with first. And so that way you can start to develop the language and skill sets. So it is easy to actually speak up and advocate for the things that you want or need. Because if you try to do it with someone, if you're first learning how to set boundaries from a more we mindset, and you do it with someone that's really doesn't have that mentality, it's going to feel very frustrating in the moment. Yeah. And so I think definitely practicing boundaries with people you feel safe with, whether it's friends, family, colleagues, just people that are going to respond in more of a constructive, positive way. That would be like my first step to really trying to elevate your boundary setting. That's going to allow you to feel heard and understood in your relationships.
Yeah. And you hit on something there I think is really important, is that be prepared at first when you do this. People may not respond immediately, right? I mean, because of all the conditioning and the trauma. And I think most people give up at that stage and revert back to those old patterns. And I confess I was guilty of that. Like, my daughter got diagnosed at only 2 months old with a serious heart defect and was in heart failure, needed open heart surgery. And everything that could go wrong did. And we spent 3 months in critical care. And for me, that was an epiphany about how, oh my God, this practice of law, it is so conflict ridden. I'm going to be different when I go back. And I did. I showed up differently. But it didn't last at first. It took me, I'm embarrassed now to say, because the response I got was that conditioned pushback kind of response. And I thought, screw this, right? I mean, I'm getting steamrolled here. And now I recognize, had I stuck with it, it would have had such a profound shift. So thank you so much for raising that point for our listeners, that start somewhere safe and be building the skills and stick with it, even if you're not getting the response that you want at the outset. I think that's
Yeah, we kind of have to think of boundaries as the same resources we need, like water, to quench our thirst. If we go
nice.
days without water, we're going to not feel great. We're going to be, at our worst. Boundaries help us have fulfillment in life and help us have clarity and transparency in our relationships for greater trust.
That's beautiful. Nice. And we talked earlier about sort of preparation in the context of assertiveness. Just be prepared so you can show up in that place. What role do you guys think preparation plays? Or more importantly, I guess, let me ask this. What are some of the most important elements that you would suggest for people if you know you're about to go into a potentially difficult conversation, whether personally or professionally? What are some of the elements that you would recommend people do to prepare to show up and get better outcomes?
Have your value-based system in place, but then also be prepared for basic questions that you need to ask that are open-ended questions, like, can you share more about X? Or help me understand how you got to Y. And the reason why you want to have discovery questions is because they help lower the defense, but they're also keeping the conversation going, which buys you time to think about what position you might want to present if you haven't come to that realization yet in the moment. So discovery questions are probably the biggest thing to always have in your back pocket when you go into a very conflictual conversation.
Also be emotionally regulated, because if you are dealing with somebody who has more of an egocentric mindset and they have a tendency to trigger you, emotional regulation is going to keep you calm and collected so you can have a logical and reasonable conversation. Because sometimes when we're dealing with these high conflict personalities, if they're intentionally trying to trigger us, it's only so they can emotionally provoke the situation in order to flip the script and manipulate the outcome to their favor. So we want to reduce emotional expression in order to make sure that the conversation stays on point in terms of the subject and the resolution we're seeking.
Yeah, great tips both. And again, I love that idea about preparing the questions. And I use that expression often too. I love that you use that about have them in your pocket. Because even when we talk about curiosity, people assume, okay, I'll just show up and I'll wing it if something comes up. Way better, as you suggest, think about some of the questions that you can ask in advance. I think that's such great advice. And also just following up on the point about that emotional regulation, I often say, choose who you want to be, right? Like pick 3 words for our listeners out there when you're going in to there's no right or wrong answer. Is it calm, collected, compelling, whatever, be intentional about who you want to be so that you can do that emotional regulation. If somebody's throwing you off, just take that breath. I want to be compelling and calm and collected in this, or whatever your words are, and allows you that great emotional regulation.
Right, because we want to have integrity with ourselves. And if
Yes.
we become emotionally reactive, we unintentionally give away our power to the other
Oh,
person.
gosh, I've been guilty of that. Oh my goodness. Yes. I look back at some of it with just absolute mortification now. So now I can't believe how fast our time has gone. We're going to have you guys back because you just have a trove of treasures for us here. And I normally like to end by asking, what's one of the greatest mindset shifts you've had in your life? So you decide who goes first, and it doesn't have to be on this topic, just something. It can be at any point in your life when you've had one of those aha moments that makes you think differently, show up differently in the world.
I think you have to trust yourself, trust your intuition, because if you allow other people's opinions to guide you, it may not be authentic to who you are as a person. So always listen to what that intuition internally tells you. And we can tap deeper into that by knowing who we are as an individual based on our values and worth.
Oh, so important. And it's funny, we used to have such strong, like if you look back even historically, like in our First Nations, people had such profound intuitive abilities. And somewhere along the line, we seem to have lost that. So I'm glad we're seeing an increased intention again about trying to really tap into those intuitions, develop them, trust them. So I think that that's a beautiful mindset shift.
I think the biggest one I would have is to don't be afraid to get uncomfortable. I think the biggest lessons that we've gained in life is putting ourselves outside of our comfort zone. And that's how you grow and you keep evolving and you keep elevating. And you might think at one moment, like, oh, I can't do this, or what is everybody else going to think? In that moment, you can prove to yourself. And yet when we prove to ourselves and achieve new goals, we build our own inner confidence and our value. So don't be afraid to get outside your comfort zone.
Oh, and there's layers on that. I love that. I think that's so great because not only trying new things and not being afraid of failure, and in fact, embracing the fail, have those fail-abrations where we celebrate them, right? To be able to learn and grow. It's a beautiful way to be able to live our lives. So, well, thank you. You guys have just dropped so many gems for us here. Where can we learn more about you, Jan and Jillian?
You can head over to janandjillian.com where we can also connect with us for business relationships at 28consultancy.com or family mediation. You can also find the link at janandjill.com. You can grab our book at Amazon or Google Play or Apple Books.
Beautiful, beautiful. And ask your local bookstores to bring them in. I'm always a big fan of supporting those independent bookstores who struggle so much. Well, thank you both for joining us and sharing. Yeah, I love what you do. I think it's so important in the world today. So keep on doing what you're doing, and we'll definitely have to have you back. Thank you both so much.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you.
And for our listeners out there, I have no doubt you got lots of value from this episode. I know I did. This has been a really interesting conversation. We covered so much ground in such a short period of time. Give the gift of sharing. Make sure to share this episode with other people as well so they can get the benefit of showing up more powerfully in their relationships, both personally and professionally. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't done that yet. And before we sign off today, I just wanted to share some ways that we can work together if you're looking to up-level your negotiation skills to negotiate a better life, because all of life is a negotiation. I've got everything from online to group to my signature mastermind one-on-one VIP experiences to help you better leverage your innate power to get more of what you want and deserve in life. If that sounds interesting, check it out at artoffemininenegotiation.com. And also make sure to grab a copy of my book of the same name, The Art of Feminine Negotiation. And we'll make sure to put all of Jan and Jillian's information in our show notes as well, so you can check them out. And that is a wrap for this episode. Until next time, go forth and find ways that you can practice more on purpose. Find a better way to practice law so you can rekindle your passion and make a difference in the world while negotiating your best life on your terms. Until next time, take care.